Hello everyone, welcome to BrainMap. This seminar series is co-sponsored by the P40 Funded Center for Mesoscale Mapping, housed in the Martinos Center. It is our great pleasure today to have Dr. Christopher Kuzawa. Dr. Christopher Kuzawa is a biological anthropologist with interest in developmental biology, brain metabolism and evolution, and health. After having spent 22 years in the Department of Anthropology at Northwestern, in January 2025, he moved to the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. His research explores developmental influences on adult biology and health, the psychobiology of human fatherhood, and the energetics and evolution of human brain. Since arriving, he has new collaborations with several groups at Martinos, including studies of brain metabolism and the energetics and the metabolism of obesity. He's an elected member of the U.S. National Academy of Science and the American Academy of Arts and Science. He received his Ph.D. in anthropology and MS and PH in epidemiology from Emory University. I would like to remind our audience to have their question at the end of the talk, and without further ado, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. It's really great to be here. I know I'm probably an unusual speaker for this series because I don't really have a background in neuro or psych. I'm a biological anthropologist. And, as mentioned, I just moved to Harvard after 22 years at Northwestern. And one of the real draws was Martinos and all of the amazing brain imaging work that's done in this area. Because I have this side interest on the brain, its evolution, its energetics, that I'm going to talk about today. But really, my main work, most of what I've done over the last, 3 decades really, is work in the Philippines in a place called Cebu. Just a quick background on this. City of about 4 million people. And I work with a longitudinal birth cohort study that began back in 1983, enrolled 3,000 plus pregnant women, and then followed those women and their kids now for 43 years. I got involved with it back here in 1998, so I've been working on the study for about 28 years. And then I and my students, my collaborators, we've focused on a lot of different questions using these data, right, as the cohort has gotten older. What you don't see up here is the brain. So everything I'm going to talk about today is not my main kind of field work. And when you look at this, it actually probably looks a lot like a public health study, and it really is. Like, we publish in public health journals, medical journals, et cetera. The difference is that because we're anthropologists, our work really builds from evolutionary theory, and specifically something called evolutionary life history theory, which is about how species evolve, their differences in life cycles, right? Their pace of growth, how long they live, their body size, and so on. And this is going to be really crucial to everything I'm going to talk about today. So I wanted to give a brief primer on this to begin. When you think about evolution, typically we think about the evolution of things like this, like a wing, right? It looks like it's designed to do something, or a opposable thumb grabbing something, right? Or coloration to avoid predation, like camouflage, or to woo mates. This is typically what you think of when you think of natural selection. But much of the variation in the natural world really comes in this form here. You have mice and elephants, really similar in a lot of ways. They have 4 limbs. They give birth to live young. They're warm-blooded. Their young subsist off of milk and so on, right? They're very similar. And yet one is 1 gram at birth and lives 1 to 2 years of age, and the other is 90,000 grams at birth and lives 60 years of age, right? So how do these kinds of differences evolve? Is this also, can you think of this as an adaptation? Well, to begin to, you can actually get a pretty good clue as to what's going on with these species just by looking at this photo, because the elephant and the mouse are actually about the same size, but look at the size of their litters, right, relative to their body sizes. A mouse is radically different, okay, and has a much faster pace of life, in part because it puts almost all of its resources into reproduction, leaving very little left over for things like tissue repair, DNA repair, etc. And so if you look at different species in their lifespans, here you see the antioxidant levels are lower in mice compared to other species. DNA repair enzymes are lower in shorter lived species compared to longer lived species. And then naturally, somatic mutations are also much higher in these species, right? So they're investing less in these kinds of DNA repair processes, so you have higher rates of mutation. right? And another way that you can think about aging is epigenetically and looking at methylation rates or just methylation patterns across the genome. And methyl groups, of course, are these little chemical attachments that influence whether or not genes are expressed or turned off. And you can imagine this, like if you had basically genome-wide methylation data, you at 1 month of age, a mouse might look like this. And then at age 3, it looks like that. And age 6, it looks like that, and so on, right? So there are these predictable changes in methylation that are happening across the life cycle. If you have genome-wide data for animals of different ages, you can then use that and machine learning to generate what's called an epigenetic clock, right? Where you can actually predict chronological age based upon these methylation patterns. And this has been done for a lot of species. And so here you can see that in mice, about 2% of the methyl marks are changing per year in a mouse. Do the same thing for an elephant, right? But look at the rate of change. It's much, much slower, right, in the elephant. The cellular clock ticks about 30 times faster in mice than in elephants, and mice live about 1/30th as long, right? So this is part of the cellular biology that's kind of baked into these species. So why age fast is an obvious question here, right? Like short-lived species like mice could, in theory, put more resources into these processes and extend their lifespan, right? And increase, the length that their bodies are going to live. Why don't they do that? Well, a simple answer is that it'd be a complete waste of time and energy because they're going to die anyway, right? So these are voles, they're not mice. I couldn't find it on mice. But by 1 year of age, they're pretty much all dead, and that has to do with predation, right? So in theory, they could take resources and make their bodies so that they'll live for 5 or 10 years. They're going to die anyway, so it's really, there's no point. So they take those resources and instead they put them into reproduction. And so we're starting to build this framework of life history theory, right? You've got energy coming in during the growing years. Some of it goes to growth, some of it goes to maintenance. Now, maintenance includes the overhead, like with the energy that the brain is using, the heart, et cetera. But it's also these repair processes, the immune function and things like that, right? So that's also part of maintenance. And of course, there's activity running around, and then there's some energy that goes into storage, into reserves and body fat. Now, once you stop growing, that energy that had been going into growth is shunted into reproduction. So it's the same basic idea, except during the growing years, it's growth that's expended. Here, it's reproduction. And what we just talked about is this trade-off here between maintenance expenditure and reproduction, right? The mice are devoting a great deal of energy into reproduction. It's heavier than the maintenance expenditure, and that's how you end up with a mouse. Whereas an elephant is doing the opposite. It's slowing down its reproduction, putting more into maintenance, and living a long lifespan. And so this is where we get this concept of fast versus slow life history species. Now, these differences are actually present right at conception, more or less. You see this in utero, right? And so this is showing embryonic length in these species, and kind of surprisingly, the blue line is the elephants and the yellow line is the mouse, right? And that may seem counterintuitive, except it's the same logic that we just talked about with reproduction, except now we're talking about it with growth, right? You've got this trade-off between growth and maintenance. A mouse is a fast life history species, so it's putting more into growth and less into maintenance. It's growing quickly, right? Whereas a mouse is doing the opposite. It's putting more into repair and slowing its growth rate. So an elephant ends up bigger, not because it's growing faster, because it grows longer, right? So again, fast versus slow life history species. Now, this is an example of something that we've actually applied within our study in the Philippines, right? So you see this kind of trade-off between reproduction and maintenance across species. Do you see it within the same species among women who vary in how much energy they put into reproduction? And you can see here that as the number of pregnancies goes up, there's a nudging up of these epigenetic clocks, suggesting that there's a faster pace of biological aging. This is very subtle. It's nothing like health relevant, really, but I think it is consistent with this kind of evolutionary framework. Okay, so all of this may lead you to a question, right? You've got this trade-off. The more you put into reproduction, the less there is for maintenance, and this is going to shorten your lifespan. Why not just eat more? Can't you just eat more and like the trade-offs go away, right? And the somewhat counterintuitive answer is that not really. And I'm going to walk you through why. And this is all super critical for everything I'm going to talk about with the brain in a second. All right, so what this shows is metabolic rate. So this is like calories expended per day versus body mass. And of course, and this is a log-log plot, right? And then when you plot that as a log-log function, it's linear. And of course, as you go from small to larger species, the amount of energy expended increases. But this coefficient here, the scaling coefficient is less than 1, which shows that as, yeah.
Yeah, I want to go like this data, like let's say this trade-off between say maintenance and reproduction affects both.
Yeah, so how, that's a,
it's
yeah, no, that's a really good question. So given that males are not directly reproducing, how is that reproductive expenditure spent in males? And they still spend it. They spend it by being bigger, putting more into muscle, maybe into more competitive behaviors and so on. So yes,
is there a difference between pregnancies and
yeah, but what I'm saying,
so it's a huge
yeah.
That's a different trade-off there in
Well, like I said, you'll see it varies across species, but typically what males are doing is they're putting the energy that they would have put into reproduction if they were female into building a bigger body size, more muscle, doing things that are more competitive and so on. So that's how you see it sort of play out. So there still is a trade-off, but yes, it's clearest and most easy to sort of conceptualize in females for sure. It's not super relevant to where I'm going. Yeah, oh, no, that wasn't a question. Okay. Anyway, so as you go from small to large species, energy expenditure goes up, but it's going up at a slower pace than the rise of body weight. And what this shows is that there's an increase in efficiency as you get to larger species, right? So a gram of elephant is using about 1/8 the calories as a gram of mouse. And why this is, we don't know. Like that relationship has been documented for about 100 years, and there's still no consensus as to like explain why that pattern exists. But one really interesting model points to the structure of the circulatory system. And this is work out of the Santa Fe Institute, West et al. Basically have kind of a design problem here, right? You've got one big vessel, the aorta, that has all of the nutrient-rich blood, and you have to get that blood down to the level of individual capillaries and cells. What is the most efficient way to do that? Well, they've shown that a branching structure, right, where you have branches within branches within branches, a fractal structure all the way down to individual cells, is the most efficient way that minimizes resistance within vessels and so on, right? And so what's cool about it is that 0.75 scaling emerges from this physics. So they've argued that this is actually explaining that relationship. And when you look at plants, it's similar, right? You got one big vessel coming in, going down to smaller, and all the way down. And they've argued that for that reason, this is why when you look at metabolic processes in plants, there's a 0.75 scaling, right? So they've argued that this physics is actually fundamental to all life, right? It's something that constrains energy expenditure, and it relates body mass to expenditure. Now, this is the last slide I'm going to show here. It's interesting. So what this is showing is the amount of energy that's used by a single liver cell. You can see the mouse is using much more. This is a log plot again. And this is showing what I was talking about earlier, how a gram of mouse uses 8 times the energy as a gram of elephant, right? Same thing, except here we have horse and mouse. The mouse cell is using much more. What's interesting about this is that these are isolated liver cells. They're actually in petri dishes. Right? So they're not even in the body. And what this shows us is that those constraints on energy expenditure that are linked to body mass, right, that kind of constrain expenditure at the level of body mass, that those are kind of baked in now at the level of cells. Cells have actually evolved or developed to expect that level of expenditure specific to that species. Right? What all this means is that organisms do have a finite ability to digest, distribute, and put energy to productive use. Thus, the implication of that is that if you increase expenditure on one thing, there's going to be a trade-off. You have to reduce expenditure elsewhere, right? And humans are right on that line. And so this is where, we're very much constrained by that as well. And so here's where we start to extend this out and think about how this applies to the brain. Okay, so similar kind of framework. Here we have energy expenditure on the brain versus energy expenditure within the body, within primates. And you can see that humans are above the line. This is a log plot, so it's quite a bit above that line. We devote about 2.5 times the energy to our brains than a primate of our size, and about 7 times the energy of a mammal of our size. And again, so we're putting much more into our brains, and yet we're right on the line for total expenditure, which means that energy had to come from somewhere. There had to be a trade-off. And so this has been one of the big kind of mysteries within anthropology, like how did we afford these very highly costly organs? And you've all heard the statistic, right, that the brain consumes about 20% of our energy at rest, much higher than in most species. The main thing I want to point out is that is the figure in the adult, right? That's over here. And what we've been interested in is over here, like how high are those figures when you start to think about childhood and development, right? And so that's what I've focused on, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. Okay, so the remainder of the talk today, talk about how we quantify the cost of the brain, how much it costs, kind of get at that developmentally across the life cycle. And then think about the implications of this for the evolution of childhood and our life history. A few minutes on that. Talk about some of the policy and public health implications, and then some kind of in the works validation work that's hopefully going to allow studying some of this in healthy kids. Okay, so one hint that we had going back decades that the brain was extremely costly to develop had to do with the fact that we grow very slowly as a species. And you may not, be aware of this. You just think kids grow at the rate that they do. But our species, our kids actually grow extremely slowly. And so if we're growing very slowly, it's probably going into maintenance, and the brain is a good candidate for, having used that energy, right? So that was the idea. But let's take a quick look here. I'm going to show you how slowly we grow, and I think it's kind of a surprising story. So again, energy increases with body size, but with this 0.75 scaling. Naturally, when you look at growth rate, it's going to have that 0.75 scaling because it's a fraction of that overall expenditure, right? So that makes sense. You've got the same kind of slope there. And then here we have mice and rats and guinea pigs and sheep right on the mammal line. Reptiles are down below, as you would expect, because they're cold-blooded. This is a log scale over here, so it's quite a bit below. Where things get weird is when we plot humans. We're right more or less on the reptile line, right? And if we go into this database and actually get the data points that are right next to us, the mammals that are our size, okay, that are adjacent to us, this is what our growth rate looks like. And this is what I mean when I say we grow slow. We grow really slow compared to other species that are our size. But when you compare us to the other reptiles that are our size, we look just like a python. Okay. So it's super weird. We grow at the pace of a reptile. Why is this, right? And again, the anthropologists, maybe they were right. Maybe our brains are so costly that we've had a slower growth. This is something very unusual about our species. We have this super costly brain. Maybe that explains why we have this very other very unusual characteristic of super, super slow growth. So we set out to test that, and we refined it, right? So if our expensive brains explain our slow growth, we hypothesized that the ages of highest brain energy needs should also be the ages of slowest growth. You should see a correspondence between those consistent with a trade-off. Of course, how do you measure that? Everybody here knows how PET is probably the gold standard way of trying to measure brain energetics. And these are data from Harry Chugani, collected back in the 80s. Harry was a collaborator on these analyses, and we used his data. But you can see that the brain is literally brightest, right, in this realm here, somewhere between 3 and 6 years of age. And here's his data from the 1987 paper that he published. Here's the adult controls. You can see that babies they start off with a lower rate of glucose uptake per gram of tissue, but then it rapidly rises to about twice the adult level by childhood. Okay, so what's going on at this age? Well, we think it has a lot to do with synaptic densities, right? So you have synaptogenesis happening. You've got this period of peak synaptic density, synaptic exuberance, and then synaptic pruning after that, right? And a lot of cognitive development is happening at that age, and I'll come back to that a little later. This is also the point at which gray matter is at its sort of lifetime peak, right? So we think that is what is underlying Chugani's data, those data that show this kind of peak in glucose uptake rates at that age in particular. So with those data, we were then able to quantify the brain's costs. So we used Chugani's data, fit some splines through them. And then we had, and of course, that tells you how much glucose per gram of brain. We need to know for the brain as a whole, right? So we use volumetric data and then just kind of multiply through. This took years to find all these data and sort of put it all together. And this is what we found, right? So the amount of energy, the amount of glucose that's being used by the brain is peaking out at about age 5, right? When it's this level. Here you can see the adult level. So what's amazing is that the 5-year-old's brain is using twice the energy of the adult's brain in an absolute sense. And if you think about how small their bodies are, right, this is a huge burden for their bodies to sustain. And so when you look at it as a percentage of the body's resting metabolic rate, right, which is 20% in adults, it's 66% in 5-year-olds, or 4 to 5, right? So it's an enormous burden for their bodies to have to sustain. All right, so now that we have that, we were able to get at this question. Are ages of peak brain energy needs also the ages of slowest body growth and vice versa? And are they? If they weren't, this would be a bad talk. They are. Okay, so let's take a look at it. So here we have growth rate, and this is just the first derivative of the weight, this weight series that we're using, the body weight series. And you can see that we're bottoming out at about 5 years of age. This is when we most look like a reptile. And when you paste on that, superimpose upon that, the brain energy curve, you can see that they're almost identical mirror images, right? And in fact, if we plot these one versus the other, they're almost perfectly linear and inverse. Okay, so I think these data definitely very strongly support this idea that had been out there, that we grow slowly because our brains are so costly. So we can start to put this together. I'm going to build a little bit of a model here, okay, before thinking about some of the public health implications and also some of the imaging approaches to trying to study this. So we evolved this super costly form of learning. A very high percentage of our brains, of our body's energy is required to sustain that, right? 66%. We slow our growth rate. Now, in order to reach the same adult size, if we're slowing our growth, of course, we have to grow for longer. So we have to delay maturity, right? So that's sort of implicit here. And when you delay maturity, you have more time to learn, right? So there's an interesting feedback that's set in motion here. And I'm going to build out this picture. But one of the things that became clear to us as we plotted these data and started to think about them is that the developmental timing of this brain energy peak, yes. Yeah. So when do we stop growing and become adult? Yeah. And so we actually are very delayed in that relative to other species. So we grow super slow. It takes us a long time to reach our adult size, right? So those are sort of linked. Yeah, basically puberty.
Something I remember reading is that that's actually shifted in the past century, that puberty is now much earlier. For a good period of time, it was usually 18, 19.
Yeah.
Is your research incorporate that all? Because you're saying your study's been going on for like 70 years. So
no, that's a great question. So the age so we have very good records of the age at menarche in Northern Europe and Western Europe. And it used to be like in places like with good records, like the Netherlands and Norway and so on, it used to be like 18. And then there's been this linear decline, right, down to where it is now, more like 12. And that has been traced to changes in nutrition, that speed growth and so on. This is a really interesting kind of, I wouldn't say it's a wrinkle. It's something that we need to try to figure out how it's going to relate to everything I'm going to talk about in a second. I think this is exactly the kind of thing that I think is a really interesting question. I think part of what's going on is that the trade-offs are maximal, right, at 6 years of age. And then there's the strength of those trade-offs actually weaken as you go towards puberty, right? Because the brain is not as dominant in the body's energy budget. And so it may be that shifting that timing of maturation, some of that trade-off is sort of uncoupled at that point because the brain is not as costly as a fraction of the body's energy budget. But we'll come back to that. Okay, that's a really, really excellent question. So I'm going to just build this out, right? So we've got high brain energy costs, slow growth, delayed maturity as a way to reach the same size. You got more time to learn. But this is what we quickly realized, that the developmental timing of the peak in the brain's energy requirements, and this is tapping into anthropological work that may not be familiar here. I'm going to walk you through it. It points to the importance of food sharing and the cooperative raising of kids as likely prerequisites for the evolution of this very energy intensive form of learning. And these are ideas that had been proposed by these anthropologists back in the day. And I think our data really support this. And let me walk you through it. So I just showed you that growth rate is just bottoming out here, right? At the age when the brain is just pulling energy away from the body. And not surprisingly, part of what also goes down is fat deposition, right? So babies are putting on a ton of baby fat, but by childhood, it's basically stopped. Like this is boys, it's a little different in girls, but there's almost no fat deposition happening in childhood. And this results in a pattern of fat and body composition that is well known. So babies start with a lot of fat, they start to lose it, right? And they have their lowest, this is tricep skin fold. So this is basically with calipers measuring the thickness of the fat here. very common way of measuring it. And they're kind of bottoming out here. Now, if you superimpose upon this, the peak in brain energy needs, it's clearly more or less coincident with that lowest point. Here's where the problem comes in. The brain is not just energetically costly, it's also an obligate energy user, right? You can't turn it down. You can turn down your muscle by being less physically active. You can turn down digestion. There's a lot of things that you can reduce expenditure on. The brain is not one of them. And so we have 66% of the entire budget of the body that's being devoted to something that's non-negotiable. And so it's like mortgage or it's like rent. It's like having, a rent that accounts for 66% of your paycheck, right? Which is a lot. And that's exactly what's happening. And if you have rent that accounts for 66% of your paycheck, you better have a decent amount of savings, right? Because if you lose your job, you're going to lose your house. So the bigger the mortgage, the bigger your savings should be to buffer that. And it's exactly the opposite. We have this huge mortgage, 66%. And we're at the lifetime lowest point of energy reserves, right? And so there's a bit of a paradox here. How did evolution push our species out into this very vulnerable state energetically? And this is where we get into how we raise our kids. So in most mammals, it's the mother and milk that provide the offspring with energy. And as they wean from milk onto provisioning themselves, right? So nobody else is in the picture. Of course, fathers are part of it often for us, but also we have, most kind of iconically, we have what's called a cooperative breeding system. So we have all these allo caregivers. My son is at school right now, and the teachers there are allo caregivers, right? Because I'm not having to actually take care of them right now. This is our system. So we have grandparents, we have and so on that are all part of the caregiving unit. And these caregivers, and this is in the context of hunting and gathering, and I'll talk about that in a second. These caregivers are in turn embedded within networks based on cooperation and food sharing. Okay, and so this is everything I'm talking about here is about hunter-gatherers, because agriculture was first developed 10,000 years ago. Prior to that, for hundreds of thousands of years, and really for millions of years, our ancestors lived in bands of cooperative, small foraging bands that moved around nomadically, right, and cooperated to hunt, right? And so when you look at modern hunter-gatherer populations, they give us some insights into what was likely the strategy back in our evolutionary past. And so this is some modeling showing the value of pooling resources, right? So this is showing the day-to-day variation in returns if you don't share with anybody. This is the feast-famine scenario. You go out and either you get a kill or you don't, and you either eat or you don't. But if everybody starts pooling, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different people pool, as long as somebody gets a kill every day, everybody eats, right? So the variability day-to-day goes down. And this is exactly what human foragers do, hunter-gatherers, right? So these are Hiwi and Ache, hunter-gatherers in the Amazon basin. You can see the families share with many other families, right? So resources are flowing. Here are the Hadza, which are hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. This was an economic game where they gave them honey sticks and they saw how they kind of flowed through society. You can see they went to genetic kin, to their in-laws, and to friends. The point is that calories are flowing through society, right? Like there's this metabolism and this buffering that's happening that makes sure that everybody gets fed. And this effectiveness of this social buffering, which is very unique to our species, provides the safety net that allows us to have this enormous, right, mortgage when we have very minimal savings in our bodies, right? Because we can rely upon the group to feed us, basically. Okay, so food sharing and cooperation is key to this. Like that was really required for this system to evolve. Which cognitive abilities allow humans to form large cooperative social groups? Let's take a look at that. And of course, we need memory. We need to keep track of who's who we can trust, who has good reputations, bad, etc. Right? Basis for reciprocity. We need to be able to delay gratification, because if you're going to give food to somebody today in the hopes that you get food in the future, that's delaying gratification. That's by definition, right? And then finally, we need theory of mind, the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and sort of think about how they're thinking about the world, what their strategies are, right? All of this stuff is important. These are kind of components of what we call executive function. And when is executive function developing most rapidly? I mean, famously, it continues to develop into the 20s, but it's really developing rapidly in this band here, right? Which is more or less exactly the band when the brain it's at its sort of energetic peak. And we think that prefrontal cortex is actually probably a big part of this energy peak. This is what's developing very rapidly at this age. Right? And so here's some meta-analysis data that sort of back this up. Each of these data points is a study, and this is the percentage of kids who pass this cognitive flexibility switching test. And that, you know, by the beginning of that energy peak, it's about 25%, and it's up to about 100% by the end. So this is a period of very rapid executive function development. And then you can see the same thing for theory of mind. Right, so here's a similar kind of test. You know, you can see that we're going from very low to almost everybody can pass those theory of mind tests by the end, right? So high brain energy needs create this period of vulnerability, but the adult cognitive skills that are resulting from that period of very rapid cognitive development are also the safety net that allows that pattern to evolve in the first place, right? So there's another interesting feedback here, and we can, yeah.
So we talk about which is actually age range where executive function as control is typically indicated as not, it's being the developmental stage, but actually not being harnessed or mastered in that variability state. So
Yeah.
Curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what that probably tells us is that when you look at why the fabric of a social group is cooperative and why people get along and follow the rules and share and reciprocate and so on, that it's probably the adults that are doing that more than the adolescents, right? I mean, so I think these cognitive abilities that are being wired up, they're really maturing, right, and reaching their sort of, yeah. I mean, does that make sense or no? Are you're saying like you think that adolescents should already have the ability to have great executive function?
Right, based on these numbers, but adolescents is also a period where there's greatest vulnerability because that's when they get into trouble a lot more because they don't have it possible. They are still developing their executive functions. I'm just wondering about the yo-yo pattern.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, and I just don't have any sense for this, is the energy question, right? Like how energetically costly are different components of this and at different points in the life cycle? And based upon the data that I have seen, it looks like whatever's happening between 4 and 6 years of age is more energetically costly than what's happening in adolescence. Even if what's happening in adolescence is actually functionally very important, it seems like a lot of the energetic work is happening in childhood, even though that's not actually getting you to a mature state where you're, you know, adult-like. I mean, that's the only way I can answer that question because I don't know. But what's clear is that the energetic signature really points to 4 to 6 is when the energy is really going to the brain, more so than in adolescence.
Thinking about sleep, because when you talk about nature conceptions,
Yeah.
younger kids need sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. There was a point when I tried to compile a bunch of data on developmental changes in sleep duration and also different. So energy to the brain goes down during, what is it, REM and slow wave, I believe. And so that was, you know, an idea that I tried to explore. Do you see evidence for developmental changes in some of that might also be part of this story? You know, and it was hard to pull all that together, but I think it's an interesting possibility. We good?
Forming synapses.
Yes.
So, happens lessons that tour, so to speak.
Yes.
But the island and ionization and the importance of those connections has not yet formed. So to give you exactly.
Thank you. That's exactly.
And that is much less energy intensive than building cities.
Yes. I mean, myelination, you've got oligodendrocytes and you're basically putting, you know, you need cholesterol as a precursor. And it's just energetically, it's nowhere near the cost of synapses. And that's absolutely true. And so that, you know, I guess part of what's going on with executive function maturation is probably more white matter than gray matter at that point. And that might be part of the answer. We good? Good enough? Okay.
So we actually have one question from online audience.
Sure.
So the question was, how about obese kid versus skinny kid? Look like the obese kids still have a lot of energy left after taken by the brain. Wouldn't be that obese kids grow faster?
So is the question, do obese kids grow faster? Yes, they do. In general, they're more likely to reach maturity earlier. And so this kind of gets into the question earlier about the change in age at menarche historically and the fact that we were at 18 and down to 12. Some of that is recapitulated in overweight versus underweight, in the same population. And yeah, I'll come back to that because I think that part of what's going on there is that you're not necessarily shifting the kind of dynamics of the peak energy requirements and these trade-offs that I'm talking about. It's more at the tail end when the brain is not as dominant, right? And there's more kind of leeway, the trade-offs are not as strong. And so I think there is more ability for growth rate to speed up. That's my best guess, but let's go ahead and finish this. And we can also come back to that point because it's come up twice now. I want to flesh this story out, right? So we have this that we've talked about, right? This high energy requirement of learning leaves us very precarious for the reasons that I said. It's a high mortgage with low savings, right? How do we do that? Well, we have this cooperative system where resources flow, right? And make sure that everybody gets fed. So that this is part of how we were able to do that. How do we cooperate and share? We just talked about executive function theory of mind that are happening here, right? And that are part of that, allowing that system to happen. Now, back here, okay, I talked about how growth rate slowed and therefore we expect or kind of need delayed maturity to reach the same size. But if you go back to like the original part of my lecture, right, what I talked about is how predation rate actually set how quickly, how fast or slow a species is, right? So if predation is very high, mortality is very high, you have to speed up and reproduce or you're not going to reproduce at all. And as mortality goes down, you can stretch things out and become more elephant-like, right? And so what's implied here is if we delayed maturity, we had to have reduced mortality. That really had to have happened, right? In order to allow that to happen. And so where did that come from? Well, probably from cooperation and food sharing and the fact that we live in these groups, right, in our social groups. A lot of species herd, right, or fish school as a way to reduce predation. And they, of course, that they do get that benefit, but then they have to compete with one another for food, right? So there's this sort of trade-off when you herd. What humans do is we come together and we reduce predation by being a group, but then we have this magical strategy of pooling our resources and we actually increase our food security. So it's a completely unprecedented trick that we pull off, right? We kind of have our cake and eat it too, right? And of course, we also are not just learning, we're also, our brains, we're learning skills and knowledge that are reducing mortality. So that's part of the story. And then finally, if we go back again to the elephant versus mouse example, right? As mortality goes down, you expect the pattern of allocation to go towards favoring maintenance and less reproduction, become more elephant-like, right? And kind of slow things down and stretch out the life cycle and extend lifespan. And as you extend lifespan long enough, as we've really extended it, we actually get grandparents, which is unusual because now we actually outlive our own reproduction. We're still alive and part of the productive unit. And this is an important part of our life history that anthropologists have written a lot about, is the fact that we have these intergenerational transfers, both of knowledge, but also of resources, right, that go back into the system that are part of this. Okay, so this life history, this is our life history. And the brain is not the whole story, but I think it helps us organize our thinking around it, right? It buys us a lot of energy, obviously, that allows all this stuff to happen, but it also buys us time, right? It allows us to slow things down, have time to learn. It allows us to slow things down and to have these long lifespans, long enough where we can actually transfer the information back to the next generation and so on, right? So this is the human life history, and this is where I think the brain piece fits into this. Now, a few policy implications of our findings. And this will start to get into one of the questions that recently came up. The first question is there a second critical period when nutrition is crucial to cognitive development? So this is, I think, the most basic question. What do our findings suggest for nutritional needs during preschool? All right. We've known that there's a critical period in cognitive development nutritionally during the first couple of years when brain growth is rapid. All right, there's been a lot of work done on that. But our data show that the brain's energy requirements are actually peaking out after that. And it's a bit invisible to those who are not thinking about metabolism of the brain because brain growth is done at that point or very close to it, right? So it has not been a focus of kind of supplementation efforts. But we think that this could be an important period. And again, what is developing at that age? Well, executive function is very rapid at that age. What is executive function important for? Following multi-step instructions, waiting a turn, shifting attention between subjects, solving problems, managing frustration and emotional responses. Okay, executive function is crucial to educational psychology, right? This is all about school readiness. It's super important as a predictor of who does well in school. And we see here from our data that these are very likely, it's very energetically costly. And so when you think about programs like Head Start, National School Lunch Program, women, infants, and children, and so on, some of these that are no doubt under threat right now with this administration, these could be very important for long-term outcomes at this age. And then question number 2. Okay, because the brain dominates energy expenditure in childhood, might variation in brain energetics influence energy balance and thus patterns of growth and weight gain? Now, who ends up gaining excess weight? It's not just a function of calories, right? It's hormones, microbiome, there's a million things, genetics. But what we do know is that you do need 9 calories in order to put down 1 gram of fat, right? So that balance sheet actually is important. And then, of course, you've got calories in as part of the balance sheet, and then you got calories out, and there's all these various factors, but we tend to focus on physical activity as the kind of lever, right, where you can increase expenditure. Our data show that kids are actually spending more energy on their brains than they are on physical activity, right, between 2 to 7 years of age, which I think is kind of amazing, right? All we have is our one graph. We have no idea how variable this is across populations in relation to things like SES, education, enrichment, et cetera. We have no idea. Right. And so this could be an important part of the story of who ends up gaining weight and so on. And I think we have some good initial hints at that. So what this shows is related to what I showed earlier. This is now the body mass index. It's like weight versus height, sort of how heavy you are relative to your weight. And babies, of course, are quite heavy. All right. They're kind of plump. And then the BMI goes down to its lowest point here. And then it literally rebounds. Right. And so this is called the adiposity rebound. Kids who go through the adiposity rebound earlier start to put on weight earlier and then end up heavier as an adult as a result of that. And that's been known since the 80s, unrelated to anything that we've been doing. But what we've shown here, what I hope to have convinced you of, is that everything is slowing down, right? Growth rate, et cetera, fat deposition, because of the brain's extreme energy requirements at this age, right? So we think that these are actually epiphenomena of this, right? And that these are going to be tied. And so as a first attempt to start to look at this, we used 4D flow. This is phase contrast blood flow data that were collected by collaborators at Northwestern that we used for this. And here's the same data, right? So we plotted it across age. See, it's peaking out about the same age that glucose is peaking out in our other data. But look at this, the adiposity rebound here clearly coincides. Now, that could be a coincidence, right? It could be a coincidence that body fat is bottoming out at exactly the age when the brain is requiring so much energy. I don't think it is. I think they're tied. And I think if we want to understand body composition trajectories, how they vary across populations, why this adiposity rebound is predictive and so on, that we need to understand this connection, okay? That there's really important unaddressed possibilities here. And we know, for instance, that environmental enrichment, we can sort of triangulate from other kinds of studies to see whether or not this might be important. Environmental enrichment increases things like cortical thickness, right? Gray matter volume, even brain volume. There's studies that show this, right? Like if you have highly educated parents or parents that are more involved in raising you, more nurturingly, you actually see differences in these structures that we know are energetically costly. There are increasing data showing that psychosocial stress can actually accelerate the timing of cognitive development, right? Which would push the timing of that energy peak earlier and might have time, effects on the timing of the rebound, right? So could these differences in experiences drive variation in brain energy allocation and energy balance and thus body weight composition? The answer is we have no idea. Again, we have our one energy curve that we kind of glued together from these various sources. There's been no attempt to try to see how variable this is across populations, what it responds to, its implications for things like growth and body composition and so on. And so one thing that's in progress is validating some measures with Qinghwan and Leo, who's here, that will hopefully be child friendly. So using total cerebral blood flow in particular as a proxy for this. And this is what I want to end with. And of course, here I'm especially interested in any feedback or thoughts. we're trying to come up with some measures that can be incorporated into studies of healthy children, because of course PET can't be. And there's two tiers of questions here. If we're just interested in how much energy is going to the brain versus the body as a way to try to understand who's gaining weight, for instance, all we need to know is global brain energy expenditure. We don't necessarily care where it's being used or how, right? And so that's one class of question. And then there's the questions that actually require spatial resolution, right? What particular kinds of functions maybe are most costly and so on. You could push the questions further with that kind of data. You've got, of course, glucose uptake using FDG PET is going to be the gold standard here. You've got oxygen uptake and blood flow. Pretty much ruled out oxygen uptake is a measure of global brain energy expenditure in kids. And this is because of the work out of Rakel's group and others that what they've done here is they've compiled, right? This is glucose, this is blood flow, and this is CRMO2. So this is oxygen. These are, age changes in all of these. And glucose uptake and blood flow follow very similar curves, right? Where they're about twice the adult level, whereas the oxygen-based measures are quite blunted during that peak. And so they've argued that this has to do with aerobic glycolysis, that a lot of the glucose going into the brain at this age is not being oxidatively metabolized. It's entering glycolysis, and it's part of synaptogenesis and more structural functions, right? So you're not gonna pick that up. If you use an oxygen-based measure, you're gonna systematically underestimate the cost of the brain at this age. So we ruled that out. We really think that blood flow, this yellow line, is where it's at. This is going to be the best proxy. I've already shown you some of the data that we have that I think really recapitulate the pattern that we see with glucose. Like, I know it's just associational at this point, but this is something that we hope to validate. There's also, so the data that I just showed were phase contrast. Of course, you can do this with ASL as well. So this is Human Connectome Project work showing something similar, right? It started about the age of the peak, so we can't actually see what it looks like over here, but it's similar. One thing that was very interesting about this particular study is they looked by parcel, right, at perfusion rates, and then they linked that up to glucose metabolism in those parcels that were from an atlas that was published by Rakel's group, right? So they're basically taking blood perfusion from their study and relating it to published kind of atlas data on glucose uptake rates. And you can see there's an amazingly high correlation here, right? So these aren't even the same people or anything, right? And they're still very tightly correlated. So I think this is more evidence that blood flow is going to be a good way to try to get at glucose uptake non-invasively. And here's a study that involves some researchers at Martinos. Similar, right? So here you have peak is looking like it's more like at age 7, right? As opposed to ours, which were earlier than that. So I don't know what to make of that, but another study that I think is more or less repeating the same pattern. So those are ASL studies. They're widely used. I think this is, one option. What I've seen is that there's a systematic underestimation of blood flow using ASL compared to gold standard methods. So it seems like that could be a limitation. It also seems like that systematic underestimation is greater in males for some reason. And that might help explain why those two curves, the male curve is actually shifted quite a bit below the female curve in both of those studies that I just showed. So the data that, if you're just interested in how much energy is coming into the brain, all you really need to do is quantify blood through these two sets of vessels, right? Through the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries. And this is what the phase contrast approach does. So here's, the internal carotids. Here they're looking at basilar. It's actually preferable to look at the vertebral because some blood is actually being lost, is actually going to the brain in between here and here, right? So these are actually the better measures. But once you have those, they're not as commonly used, but they're, I think, a pretty good way to try to get at a good correlate of glucose uptake. And then if you use 4D flow, of course, then you can have spatial resolution of where blood is flowing in the brain and so on. All right, so this is something that we're actually we will be validating later this summer versus PET. And then finally, EEG proxies, and this is very much like kind of speculative. EEG, like for the kinds of work that I do working in a place like the Philippines, it's not going to be simple for me to get people into a magnet, right? So if I could get some proxies with EEG, this would be great. And also there's a ton of EEG data out there, right, that already probably could be mined and used to look at some of these questions. So validating EEG measures is another thing that we're thinking about. If you look at total EEG power, right, it's following a very similar pattern. There's some reason to think that those are going to be correlated. One problem, though, is that low frequency bands like gamma tend to relate positively to energy use, where other bands like alpha are inversely related to energy use. And so you're combining all of those here. It seems like a very murky way to try to get at this. So one thing that has come up is another possibility is the aperiodic offset, which reflects asynchronous broadband background synaptic activity. Not specific to synchronous processes. It's not specific to those bands and could be a proxy for global brain energy use. Here's a study that plots that, and you can see that it follows a roughly similar pattern as what we're seeing with glucose. And then another possibility would be to use machine learning and have multiple measures and see what actually is your best combination of predictors. And that's another possibility. So this is another thing that we're going to be looking at this fall. And I just want to give a quick shout out to various collaborations that are in the works or planned with some of the folks here, which I'm really looking forward to. If any of you have ideas about any of this or data that are relevant to any of these questions, I'd love to hear from you. And that's all.